They called him just the janitor. They mocked the way he walked, the way he wore his badge like it meant something. But he didn't correct them. He just showed up early enough to open the building and late enough to sign their paychecks. Because some power doesn't speak. It listens. This is the quiet story of Thomas Langley, a man once at the top, now holding a mop by choice. After selling most of the company he built, he returned under a different name, in a different uniform. Nobody knew the old man cleaning the floors still held the keys to the entire system. But he watched. He remembered. And when the time came, he didn't shout. He simply moved one piece and changed everything. This is not a tale of revenge. It's a lesson in silent power, and why the ones we overlook often hold the door we walk through. I start my mornings before the sun has the courage to rise. It's always the same hallway, marble floors with a hairline crack by the elevator, a coffee stain no one ever seems to notice except me, and a line of ceiling lights that hum just a little too loudly when it rains. That morning I was buffing the far end near the west entrance when I heard them. 3 of them, maybe 4. Young, sharp suits, voices pitched just enough to sound important, but still loose from the aftertaste of happy hour. He even wears the name badge like he owns the place. One of them chuckled. Another added, "Yeah, and those orthopedic shoes? Classic. Old guys committed to the role." I kept my head down, and my hands moving in smooth circles. Wax, pause, shift, wax again. The buffer purred like a pet I'd tamed over years. My badge, clipped straight onto my faded navy shirt, caught a flicker of light. It read, Langley, T, custodial simple, accurate enough. No one ever asked what the T stood for. They passed by without acknowledging me. That was the rule, wasn't it? Some people pass by janitors like you're just another fixture, something functional, not quite human. I didn't take offense. Fixtures don't have to impress. But I noticed one thing. The tallest one, blonde hair, tie too short, glanced back as the elevator closed behind him, not out of guilt, just curiosity. Like he was trying to place where he'd seen me before. He hadn't. People don't remember what they choose to look past. By 6:45 a.m., the building was half awake. I unlocked the maintenance closets, flipped the circuit panel for the eastern wing, restocked the supply room with fresh towels and soap. The early shift security guard, Ben, a kind man with bad knees, nodded at me without a word, the kind of respect that doesn't need conversation. At 7:02, I stood in the lobby as sunlight finally cracked through the skyline. The automatic doors sighed open, letting in a burst of April chill. Spring in Oregon is never warm, just less cruel than winter. I watched the same executives rush in, clutching coffee cups with names misspelled in black marker, fingers already swiping through unread emails. None of them noticed the floors gleaming beneath their shoes. That's fine. It wasn't for them anyway. It was for me. This place used to be mine. Every tile, every light bulb, every code in the elevator panel. I could still walk the whole blueprint in my mind, from the executive suites to the sub-basement furnace room where the first contract was signed. But these days, I prefer silence over signature walls, over corner offices and boardroom chairs. I've had all that. Now I show up early. I lock and unlock the very doors they think open automatically, and every so often someone chuckles at the janitor. They think it's harmless. It probably is. Until it isn't. There was a time when people stood when I entered the room, not because I demanded it, but because I used to carry the kind of presence that made people sit straighter, hide their screens, rehearse their reports twice over before speaking. I built Langley Holdings from a single contract in 1989, cleaning a medical office in southeast Portland, into a statewide empire in commercial building management. At our peak, we had over 200 facilities under our belt, and my signature had paved the way for hundreds of careers. But no one talks about the other cost of empire, your body. My cardiologist called it a gentle reminder. That's what he named the minor stroke that hit me one Tuesday morning while I was reviewing lease proposals over my third espresso and fifth hour in the same chair. I still remember the way my left fingers stopped listening. It was as if someone else had borrowed the controls. I wasn't frightened, just annoyed. I had meetings lined up all week. The ambulance ride was quiet. I didn't like the look on the EMT's face when he asked if I had children to call. I didn't. No spouse, either. My last real relationship ended around the time I missed our anniversary dinner 3 years in a row. She said, "You love the company more than anyone." I laughed. She wasn't wrong. 3 months of physical therapy, 27 missed meetings, and a permanent tremor in my left hand later, I made a decision. I sold 80% of Langley Holdings to a venture capital firm out of Chicago, kept just enough equity to stay on the board. They wanted to modernize the branding, streamline operations, rename departments. I let them. I knew how these stories went. You don't fight the tide. You just learn which rocks to anchor under. But before the ink dried, I did one thing they didn't notice. I split off a small unit from our original structure, the Facilities Oversight and Custodial Operations branch, and placed it under a separate LLC. It didn't look like much. A few contracts, mostly cleaning, basic maintenance, HVAC support. I made sure the paperwork was layered just enough. A holding company here, a trust there. On paper, it looked like I had simply offloaded the low-margin wing, but it was mine, entirely, quietly. Langley Custodial Services, operating under the umbrella of TL Trust Holdings, whose sole trustee was one Thomas Langley, me. That's how I kept one key to the kingdom. People think power is always loud. Speeches, titles, signatures in gold ink. But real power is subtler. It's knowing which hallway light burns out first in winter. It's having access to the payroll system back end. It's knowing who gets promoted and who doesn't, long before HR does. So I put away the suits, the polished leather shoes, and the corporate persona, and I picked up the mop again. At first it was just curiosity. I missed being inside the buildings, not overseeing them from a glass tower, but really being in them, knowing which door hinge creaked too loud, which vent rattled in cold air. I wanted to see how people behaved when they thought no one important was watching. I applied through the staffing system under a general contractor name. No one looked closely. To them, I was just a new old guy willing to work the early shift, take the low-paying hours, and never complain. Perfect. It's been 3 years now. 3 years of opening the building before anyone arrives. 3 years of listening more than speaking. 3 years of being the janitor and learning more about this company, about people, than I ever did from a boardroom seat. They don't know me anymore, and I prefer it that way, because while they laugh and pass by, I'm still here, and I'm still the one who signs the checks. It was a Thursday when the new facilities manager arrived. Young, polished, and eager, the kind that speaks in bullet points and memorizes lettership quotes for fun. His name was Daniel something, but everyone just called him Dan. He wore a lanyard that screamed middle management, walked too fast in the mornings, and had a way of pausing after people's names when addressing them, like he was trying to assert authority with punctuation. That morning, I was wheeling the mop cart past the main lobby elevator. The executive use only sign was still faintly visible on the chrome, left over from the old days when formality still had a place. No one enforced it anymore, but the culture lingered like stale coffee. Dan was standing near the elevator, holding his tablet like it was a badge of honor. He was scrolling, pretending to be busy. When the elevator arrived, I stepped in without fanfare. He followed behind me, but paused. His eyes flicked from the elevator panel to me, then back again. "Sir," he said, as if trying the word out on his tongue, "this elevator is actually reserved for management." I looked at him. Not long, just enough. Then I stepped back out of the elevator, nodded once, and pushed my cart toward the stairwell. He didn't say thank you, just stepped in and let the doors close between us. That kind of moment used to bother me. When I was younger, when I was still the man behind the mattings and the title, I would have called someone into my office. I would have made it a learning opportunity, explained the cost of dismissing people who clean your floors. Maybe I would have smiled through it, but I'd remember. Now I just walked the 5 flights up. Quiet steps, metal railing cool in my hand. I wasn't angry. I was curious. Dan had been on the job for less than a week, but in that short time, he'd already managed to dismiss the night shift's request for new gloves, reschedule the HVAC inspection without telling the contractors, and move the cleaning supply station to a storage closet with no ventilation. I knew, because I still had access. He didn't know that. Nobody does. Later that day, I walked past the break room, the one on the mezzanine level that used to be my thinking spot during late nights. It still smelled like cinnamon and printer toner. A few employees were laughing. Genuine laughter, the kind that made the walls feel warmer. I paused at the door. Dan was there again. This time he wasn't holding a tablet. He was leaning against the counter, sipping coffee, trying to fit in. One of the interns, I forget her name, smiled at me and held the door open as she walked out. Dan caught sight of me and cleared his throat. "Hey, buddy. This break room is for internal staff only." The way he said it, casual but not quite kind, sat in the air like dust. I nodded again. Same nod, same silence, but this time I walked in anyway. I didn't make a scene. I just refilled my water bottle, nodded politely to the others, and walked out the other door. No one stopped me. Dan didn't speak. Not because he suddenly remembered who I was, but because there was something in the way I moved, unbothered, unbent, that confused him. That evening I stayed late to inspect the supply intake. Alone, with the city humming beyond the tinted windows, I sat at the edge of the janitor's office and reviewed the updated organizational chart Dan had submitted. He'd removed 2 senior custodial names from direct contact chains. He'd added a mid-level supervisor with no field experience to oversee building logistics, and he'd submitted a proposal to outsource our current custodial team to a cheaper contractor. I stared at the screen. Then I opened another window, the payroll portal. My login still worked. I went into the back end, trusty Class C authorization, my domain. I didn't say anything. I just flagged the changes for review and routed a quiet memo to the board liaison, suggesting a structural evaluation of staffing oversight per subsection 7A. Anonymous, of course. I signed it, T. Langley, Facilities Oversight, no title, no fuss. The next morning, Dan was still smiling, still strolling, still mispronouncing names. But the memo had been received, and the elevator still opened when I pressed the button. Friday afternoons were for paperwork. Always had been. Back when I was CEO, it was review binders, quarterly reports, investment decks, and performance reviews. These days it was different. No glass table, no boardroom, just a beat-up desk in a supply office no one visited, and a laptop that connected me to the back end of the whole operation. I logged in. Two-factor authentication, fingerprint required, T. Langley, trustee access, custodial holdings Class C, approved. The payroll system wasn't flashy. It didn't need to be. Just columns and rows, names and numbers. But if you've been in business long enough, you know the truth. Numbers speak louder than people think. I started from the top. Dan Whitmore, $127,450 annual bonus-eligible company phone and vehicle, new line item request, consulting fee for logistics optimization. I flagged it. He hadn't optimized anything. Then the names I cared about. Miguel Rojas, night shift lead, 15 years in, quiet, arrives early, never complains. Requested a new floor buffer last month. Denied by Dan. I approved it. Added a small bonus. No one would know it was me. Sandra Cho, maintenance technician, single mother of 2. Had to cut back her hours last quarter when her daughter got sick. Still covered every emergency call. I doubled her holiday stipend. Quietly. Ben Hollis, security, knees worse every year. Still stands without asking for a chair. I added a recognition supplement, a soft phrase for a hard-earned dignity bump. And then came the rest, dozens of names, some familiar, some new. I read them like a story. The ones who smiled at the janitor got a quiet bump. The ones who sneered stayed the same. Not out of spite, out of balance. People forget how much power lives in the unseen. They forget that someone signs their paychecks. Someone with eyes and memory and just enough authority tucked behind a firewall no one notices. There was a moment, a few weeks back, when a junior associate spilled coffee in the elevator. I saw him look at me, hesitate, then walk away. No apology, no glance back. I checked his name. Travis Myers, $68,000, full dental, quarterly bonus. I didn't touch his pay, but I removed his name from the fast-track development list in HR's shared folder. It's not revenge, it's truth-telling without speaking. I kept going. Every name, every line, every number told me a little more about the culture I had once built and what it was becoming. The firm that bought the majority stake in Langley Holdings liked efficiency, metrics, upskilling, downsizing, reshuffling. I let them play their game. But down here, in the layers beneath the layers, I still had my hand on the spine of the book. I printed 3 copies of the quarterly payroll summary, 1 for record, 1 for the internal audit team, and 1 I folded quietly, slipped into a manila envelope, and left on the desk in the break room with a sticky note. For those who care to know who signs. TL. I didn't sign it with flourish, didn't add my old title, didn't even wait to see who would find it. Just folded the envelope once like a letter no one expects to receive, and walked away. It's not about recognition, it's about remembrance. Remembrance of every shoe scuffed on the same floor I wax, of every eye that looked through me instead of at me, of every kindness offered without expectation, and every dismissal given too quickly. The elevator dinged down the hall. I heard laughter, then footsteps, Then silence, like someone had paused too long over an envelope not meant for them. I didn't turn around. Some lessons are louder when left unspoken. The building had never felt more polished. Balloons in muted gold, banners with years printed in serif font, LED screens looping a highlight reel of corporate milestones. Somewhere between the artificial flower arrangements and a catering spread filled with food no one would finish, the company's 30th anniversary celebration had come to life, and I had waxed the floors for it. The event team arrived early. 2 women with matching clipboards directed interns like stagehands on Broadway. Table 4 needs to be symmetrical. No, the uplighting is too harsh on the CEO banner. Where's the plaque with the founder's quote? That one made me pause. I walked past the glass conference room where they were setting up the founder's corner. It used to be my corner office, now reduced to a photo from 1992 and a fake leather-bound guest book. They'd printed a quote in oversized gold script beneath my picture. Great companies are built by humble hands. TL. No one knew what the TL stood for anymore. That was the part I liked best. An intern walked by, nearly colliding with my cart. "Oh, sorry, sir. Didn't see you there." I smiled, nodded, kept moving. I was getting used to being invisible. By 9 a.m., the lobby was unrecognizable. Management had rented a podium, hung new light fixtures, and imported a barista station to impress visiting stakeholders. Everything smelled of fresh polish and practiced gratitude, and still no one asked who I was. Dan strutted by in a new suit that looked just a shade too modern for his shoulders. He was carrying the schedule for the event. I caught a glimpse as he stopped to adjust the placement of a bouquet. 10 a.m., welcome speech, CEO. 10:10 a.m., founder's tribute, video. 10:15 a.m., message from founding member, pre-recorded. 10:30 a.m., acknowledgement of legacy staff. 10:45 a.m., cake cutting and networking. Legacy staff. I assumed that meant me, but not in the way they thought. Around 9:30, they brought out the cake. Massive, white, and blankly celebratory, like it was trying to be impressive but forgot to taste good. A large 30 stood upright in gold frosting, surrounded by piped words like integrity, innovation, growth. Words that meant very little if you knew how many of the original staff were quietly pushed out in the buyout years. I knew, 'cause I signed the severance checks. I stood back as guests arrived. Suits, heels, name tags. A few faces I recognized from the early days, now slightly grayer, slightly stiffer. They nodded at me in passing, unsure where they'd seen me before. A woman leaned toward her colleague and whispered, "Is that the janitor that's always here early? He's been around forever, right?" The other replied, "I think so. They're giving him a shout-out, I heard. Kind of sweet." Sweet. I let the word hang in my chest for a moment, like a thread of breath before a storm. I found a quiet corner near the potted ficus by the service hallway, my usual retreat when the building got too loud. From there I could watch the stage, the banners, the projections. The CEO stepped up to the podium. Applause followed like reflex. He began with jokes about the company's humble beginnings, a nod to the old warehouse that became our first full-service client. A few safe platitudes about vision, resilience, and rising through adversity. He never mentioned my name, only the founding team, and a vague allusion to those who paved the way. I didn't mind. I knew the part that came next. He cleared his throat and looked toward the teleprompter, just off stage. "There's one more thing," he said. "Before we close this morning's ceremony, we'd like to share a message from someone who means a great deal to this company." The screen behind him flickered, black, then light, then a paused frame of someone standing under a row of old fluorescent lights, someone in a faded blue shirt, name tag barely visible. It was me. The recording had been taken months ago. A quiet tribute someone in HR had requested without telling me why. They said it was for a historical archive. I had agreed, speaking plainly about hard floors, long nights, and the satisfaction of watching something grow without needing to own it out loud. As the video played, the room went still. The voice on the screen wasn't grand, it wasn't polished, but it said things that landed differently than the polished speeches. And then came the final moment. The CEO turned back to the crowd. "Please join me in thanking one of the longest-standing members of our community, a man who has never asked for recognition, but has earned every ounce of it." He paused. "Mr. Thomas Langley." Silence. Someone clapped, tentatively. Then more, then all. I stepped forward slowly. No music, no flourish. Just a man in janitor's uniform, with the same name badge, same shoes, same calm breath. I took off my cap, and I looked at them, really looked. Some blinked in disbelief. Others glanced down, remembering jokes. A few stood a little straighter, but no one laughed. Not this time. I stepped up onto the stage the way I've always stepped into every room that mattered. Quietly. The applause softened as I approached the microphone. You could feel the confusion in the room shift into something else. Recognition, maybe, or discomfort. That beautiful, slow-burning unease that settles over people when they realize they've missed something right in front of them. I adjusted the mic, not because I needed to speak, but because it gave me a moment to breathe. The CEO was standing off to the side now, hands clasped, eyes flicking between me and the audience. I could see a few interns whispering. Dan was frozen in place, his smile still on his face, but no longer sure if it belonged there. I scanned the crowd. Some eyes widened, some dropped. There were people in that room who had looked through me for 3 years straight, spoken over me, around me, never once to me. And now I was standing here, name spelled out on the screen behind me, company logo beneath it, truth flooding the silence like a slow tide. I leaned toward the microphone. "I never needed a title," I said, voice steady. "Just a clean floor and a clear conscience." And that was it. I stepped back, nodded once, and walked off the stage. No speech, no list of contributions, no demand for acknowledgement. Just that one line, enough to let them carry the weight of their assumptions home with them. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was instructional. They watched me descend the steps, cross the lobby, and return to the janitor's cart I had left by the west wall. I picked up the towel I'd folded that morning, checked the buffer machine, straightened the spray bottle that had tilted during setup. Back to work. A few people clapped again, but the sound felt different now. Uncertain, tentative, like applause at the end of a movie that hit too close to home. When I passed by the break room later that afternoon, it was empty, except for the envelope I'd left the day before. It was open now. The payroll summary lay beside it, creased but not crumpled. Someone had read it, maybe several. Someone had noticed the signature. T. Langley, trusty small font. No flourish, but unmistakable. I didn't leave a note, didn't post a memo, didn't walk around correcting people. Power doesn't need noise to exist. That evening as I left the building, the receptionist, young man, maybe 23, stood up and said, "Mr. Langley?" It startled me. He'd never used my name before. "Thank you," he said. "For everything. I didn't know." I nodded. "You weren't supposed to," I replied. I pushed open the glass doors and stepped into the crisp Oregon air. The wind tugged lightly at my jacket. Behind me, the lights of the lobby glowed like a lantern left on for someone who might return. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The story had already told itself. The next Monday felt just like any other. The banner was gone, the stage dismantled, the cake, what remained of it, was congealed in the staff fridge next to an expired yogurt and a half-empty bottle of oat milk. The projector had been packed away, the flower arrangements wilted and tossed. All that remained of the celebration was a faint scent of rented success and a few thumbtacked "thank you" signs someone forgot to remove. I arrived, as always, before the building opened. The west hallway needed attention. Someone had tracked in a sap from the parking lot trees over the weekend. I cleaned it carefully, one section at a time, then made my way to the janitor's office and booted up the payroll system. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just watching. The staff directory had changed slightly. Dan Whitmore was still listed, but a note had been appended to his profile. Under review, managerial discretion paused. That was fast. HR had also reinstated a direct communication line with Sandra and Miguel's teams. A few overdue supply requests were marked, approved, retroactive. Small things, not dramatic, but noticeable, if you knew what to look for. I smiled, just a little, a ripple, not a wave. In the documents folder, someone had added a scanned printout of the founder's original business charter from 1989. It bore my old signature. I hadn't seen it in years. Thomas J. Langley, sole proprietor. The handwriting looked younger than I remembered, like someone else's hand had carried the ambition back then. I traced the curve of the L with my finger on the screen. I didn't miss those days, but I respected them. I closed the file and opened the operations map. Our company's internal web of custodial routes, maintenance logs, HVAC schedules, elevator reports, and oversight tiers. I could see the entire organism from here, who worked where, what broke last, what pattern was emerging. The building breathed like a body, and like any body, it needed care, not control. I adjusted one section of the schedule where Dan had overbooked the evening crew and reinstated Ben's requested security camera rotation plan. It wasn't a power move. It was simply doing the job right. And that was the thing, wasn't it? All those people last Friday, clapping, staring, suddenly remembering how to say my name. They still didn't really know me. Not truly. But they knew something now, that they had been watched by someone who never needed their attention, only their respect. And even that I never asked for. I leaned back in the office chair, old, lumpy, loyal, and stared at the faded bulletin board above the desk. A single sticky note remained there, one I had written over a year ago, after Miguel's son graduated from high school, and Sandra brought in cupcakes for everyone. Pay attention, not for punishment, for protection. That's why I stayed, not to catch people doing wrong, but to remember who did things right when no one was watching. There was a knock on the doorframe. It was Claire, from HR, late 40s, thoughtful eyes, the only person who had ever offered me a second cup of coffee without asking why I was in the break room. "I heard you're still doing the rounds," she said, stepping halfway into the room. even after the unveiling. I chuckled softly. Some things don't change. She tilted her head. They should. You've earned a desk upstairs, a nameplate even. Maybe, I said, but this one squeaks just right. She smiled, unsure whether I was serious. I didn't clarify. After she left, I sat for a while longer. No rush. Then I gathered my tools, locked the office, and walked the floor again. Same tiles, same lights, same people. But something was different. Not in them, in the space around them. A few nods held eye contact longer than usual. One young man, Travis, the coffee spiller, actually held the elevator for me. I didn't get in. I just nodded and took the stairs. Out of habit, out of principle, out of freedom. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do is continue doing what you've always done. But with the weight of being seen, I've never kept a list. No secret folder. No journal of names and slights. No tally of who called me old guy with the mop, or who offered me a folded napkin when I was cleaning up spilled soda during a staff party. But I remember, not out of bitterness, but out of pattern. Humans reveal themselves not in grand gestures, but in small repetitions. How they greet the doorman, whether they return borrowed chairs, who they hold the door for when no one's watching. And over the years, I've kept a mental ledger, not of offenses, but of alignments, like compass points, gently adjusting the way I saw the company, the people in it, and the future they were building, knowingly or not. Take Carla, for example, junior analyst, always the last to leave, always the first to say thank you when I emptied her trash bin, even when she didn't need to. 2 weeks ago, she saw me struggling with the freight door bolt. She didn't hesitate, just walked over, said, "Need a hand, sir?" and meant it. This week, she received an anonymous referral to the company's mentorship program, or Derek, the regional finance rep who once stepped over my mop bucket without saying a word. Twice. The same man who sent out an email praising discretionary spending cuts after cutting the supply budget for safety gloves. He doesn't know this yet, but his internal performance review was quietly flagged for ethical blind spots. Not revenge, just a redirection of attention. Some people call it karma. I just call it alignment. Then there's Nina, the receptionist who always greets people by name, even when they forget hers. Last year, when a delivery man slipped in the lobby, she was the only one who rushed to check on him while others kept walking. Last month, her name came up during a quiet review of front desk redundancies. I overrode the suggestion. Not publicly. Just rerouted it through the trustee channel. Just enough to remind someone, anyone, that decency has defenders. That's what the ledger is. A quiet remembering of who people really are. No ceremony, no punishment. Just small shifts in opportunity, in visibility, in trust. I don't announce these things. There are no memos, no dramatic firings, just adjustments, like tuning a piano. Sometimes it's removing someone from a committee roster before they poison it. Sometimes it's promoting someone no one else noticed, simply because they always wiped the break room counter without being asked. People ask me sometimes, those who find out who I am, why I stay in the shadows. Why not lead again? Why not reclaim the company I built? But leadership isn't about reclaiming. It's about creating space where people rise on their own and fall by their own weight. And the truth is, no one listens more than the person they think isn't listening. There's a freedom in invisibility. When no one is trying to impress you, you see who they truly are. I walked past Dan's desk this afternoon. He was still there, for now. talking quieter these days, looking over his shoulder more often. The air around him had changed, not out of fear, but reflection. Maybe, or maybe not. That's not mine to fix, just to notice. Later I passed the elevator again. A new sticker had been added next to the panel. All staff welcome. Respect rides with everyone. It made me pause. A small thing, but not meaningless. The culture shifts slowly, like a building settles after construction. It groans, creaks, realigns. Sometimes it cracks. But if the foundation is good, it holds. And I like to think the foundation here was always meant to carry more than just weight. It was built to carry people, the right ones. I stopped by the Founder's Corner before heading home. My photo was still there, the quote too, but someone had added a small brass plaque beneath it, in honor of those who built with their hands and led with their silence. No signature, no initials. I didn't need them. The building knew, and that was enough. They called it a staff appreciation gathering. No stage this time, no banners or catered pastries, just a circle of folding chairs in the mid-level conference room, a carafe of lukewarm coffee, and a tray of sugar cookies still in their plastic container. A handwritten sign taped to the whiteboard read, "To those who make things work, even when no one sees." It wasn't grand. It wasn't meant to be. But it was real. Claire from HR stood at the front, holding a clipboard with the kind of calm that doesn't need to fill space with noise. "Today," she began, "we want to acknowledge the people who don't always make the slideshows. The ones who don't write memos, but whose work keeps every memo moving. There were maybe 20 of us. Custodial, maintenance, night security, a few mailroom staff, one cafeteria worker who looked like she'd stepped away from the stove mid-shift. I stood in the back, near the door. I wasn't on the list. I hadn't expected to be. This wasn't about me. It never really was." Claire read out names slowly, like they deserved to be heard fully. "Miguel Rojas." He blinked, looked around, then stood. Someone clapped. Sandra gave a small whistle. "Nina Thompson." She smiled, hand to chest, eyes glistening. Each name came with a short line of praise. "For showing up early even when no one noticed. For fixing things others never knew were broken. For never raising your voice and still being heard." Dan was there, too. He wasn't standing at the front. He wasn't even sitting. He stood near the back, a few feet from me, quiet. I caught him watching the people he once dismissed with polite indifference. He didn't clap loud, but he clapped, and he stayed the whole time. That mattered more than he realized. At one point, Claire glanced in my direction. I thought she might read my name, but she didn't. Instead, she said something else. "There's one more thing," she said gently. "We received an anonymous note in the feedback box. It said simply, 'Don't forget the ones who see, but never speak, who build, but never ask to be named.'" She looked up. Not at me, but not away either. "I think we all know someone like that," she added. The room was still, not out of awkwardness, but out of shared understanding. People didn't turn to me. They didn't need to. Somehow the silence settled over us like a warm coat in winter. Unexpected, but welcome. Afterward there was coffee. Some lingered, some hugged. Miguel offered me one of the sugar cookies, saying, "It's too sweet, but still nice, you know?" I nodded. "Exactly." Dan came up as I was cleaning my cup. "I didn't know," he said. "I didn't need you to," I replied. He swallowed, hesitated. "Still, I'm sorry." I gave him the smallest of smiles. "You'll learn more by showing up than saying sorry." He nodded, hands in pockets, unsure if he was dismissed. I let him stay a moment longer, then walked away. Not because I was avoiding anything, but because it was already complete. Recognition, when earned in silence, doesn't need a finish line. It just needs a moment to land and a room quiet enough to receive it. That day, I didn't go back to the janitor's office right away. I walked the floors, polished a corner that didn't really need it, adjusted a crooked picture frame near the elevator, and stood by the front doors as people left, smiling more, speaking softer, holding their coffee cups just a little more carefully. No one called me the old guy that day. They didn't call me anything, but some nodded. Some said, "Have a good evening." One even said, "Thanks for everything, Mr. Langley." I just tipped my cap and let the door close behind me like a quiet full stop. At the end of a sentence, no one realized they'd been writing together. I never wanted a building named after me. Not a wing, not a plaque, not even a conference room with a framed photo and a bronze quote that gathers dust. If anyone asked me about legacy, I'd point to the floors, to the lights that turn on before the first employee arrives, to the bathrooms that smell like lemon instead of bleach, to the elevator that now carries everyone, not just the ones with titles. That's legacy, not what you leave behind for people to remember you, but what you embed into the rhythm of their day until they carry it forward without knowing why. There are no press releases about my return, no formal acknowledgement in the company newsletter, no feature story under Founder's Spotlight, and yet people have begun to move differently, slightly, subtly, as if something shifted underfoot, not cracked, just realigned. That's how culture changes, not when someone forces it, but when enough people begin to breathe a little more consciously. I noticed Miguel training a younger custodian last week, showing him not just how to clean, but where to pause. This corner gets scuffed because the mail cart turns too sharp. Slow down here, and the polish lasts longer. That's legacy. Sandra took initiative to rearrange the storage room for better ventilation. No one told her to. She just knew what was right, and did it. That's legacy. Even Dan, to his credit, has started taking the stairs twice a week. Says it helps him think. I know what he's doing. He's trying to feel the place again. Good. Let him walk the bones of this building the way I have. Let him hear what echoes. The thing about staying long enough in one place, especially in the background, is that you begin to hear what the walls remember. Every sigh of disrepair, every footstep of loyalty, every silence where a thank you should have been, that becomes your inheritance, if you let it. I opened my old Founder's file one night, just once, just to see. The first service contract, the original mop inventory, the checklist I wrote by hand during week 1. Check every corner, learn every name, make sure no one feels invisible. That third one, I failed at it. Once. Not because I didn't try, but because I thought visibility only came through promotion, through title, through salary bumps and press releases. I thought making people seen meant lifting them up to where I was. I know better now. Sometimes you see people best when you meet them at their level. No lifting required, just presence. I printed a copy of that checklist again and pinned it inside the janitor's office. No initials, just words. Claire saw it one day. Asked, "Was this yours?" I nodded. She smiled. I think we've all been following it without knowing. Exactly. Legacy isn't about being remembered. It's about making sure the right things are remembered, even if your name fades in the process. I walked the building one last time that Friday. Not because I was leaving, but because something told me I needed to see it again. Not through roles, but through meaning. A hallway that used to echo now hummed with quiet respect. An elevator that once excluded now carried 2 interns and a cleaning supervisor together, and no one flinched. A door held open, not because someone important was walking through, but because someone was carrying too many boxes. This building used to belong to me. Now it belongs to itself. And that, more than any title or stake or share, is what tells me I did something right. I came in early that Monday, as always, but something in the air told me the building no longer needed me in the same way. The lobby lights were already on. Not because I'd flipped the switch, but because Miguel had come in 10 minutes before me, just to test the backup system, he'd said. The break room didn't have a leaky faucet anymore. Sandra had fixed it over the weekend, left a note. We shouldn't wait until it drips. The janitor's closet was restocked, neatly, efficiently, without the usual note from me. Someone had started thinking like I did, long before I even noticed. And the floors? They gleamed, not because I had waxed them, because someone else had taken pride in doing it right. I walked the halls slower that morning, not because I was tired, but because I didn't feel the urgency anymore. The kind of urgency you carry when you know the place depends on your unseen effort. It didn't anymore, not entirely. The building had learned to care for itself, because people had learned to care for each other. I passed the elevator, and for the first time in years, hesitated before pressing the button, not out of habit, out of choice. I took the stairs. Halfway up, I paused at the landing and looked through the small window that overlooked the atrium. There, just below, were the new rhythms, Dan helping move boxes for the incoming interns, Nina at the front desk, teaching a temp how to reset the security system, Miguel showing someone how to align the floor buffer so it doesn't chatter on tile. The baton had been passed without ceremony, and no one even realized there had been a relay. That's how I knew I could begin to step back, not retire, not disappear, just loosen my grip. Let others hold the keys, turn the knobs, balance the weight. Not because I was leaving, but because they had finally arrived. I went back to the janitor's office, sat down, and took out the envelope I'd been keeping in the bottom drawer. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. No resignation, no announcement, just a note in my own handwriting. When they no longer need you to lead, you've led well enough. I left it there, not to be found tomorrow, maybe not even this month, just someday. When someone cleans out the office and wonders who came before, they won't need to know my name, just the way the floor feels under their shoes. I took one last lap around the building that morning. Not because anything was wrong, but because everything felt right. The kind of right you don't announce. The kind that settles into your bones, quiet and steady, like the hum of a well-tuned machine. The third-floor window, the one that always stuck during rain, had finally been replaced. Someone had filed the work order without needing my reminder. The lobby rug had been rotated to hide the fading patch near the edge. Smart. Subtle. I smiled. Near the break room, someone had written on the whiteboard in blue marker, "Leave it better than you found it." No initials, just the kind of wisdom that stays when people stop trying to sound wise. The mailroom buzzed with small talk. Two new hires were arguing about whether it was better to bring your lunch or order out, the kind of argument that means you feel comfortable, that the place belongs to you too. I passed by the founder's corner, still there, still quiet, no one standing by it anymore, not because they'd forgotten, but because they'd integrated the message. That's the best kind of legacy, when people stop pointing at the name and start living the values. On the maintenance level, I checked the furnace room one more time. The warmth, the pulse of the building, still there, constant. I ran my hand along the panel, the same one I'd once leaned on during an all-nighter, trying to figure out payroll when the system crashed in 2003. Funny how the body remembers stress long after the mind lets it go. Then came the rooftop. It wasn't part of any official route, but it was where I used to go when the noise got too loud, back when I wore ties and made decisions that made people rich or redundant. Up there, everything was still. You could see the city breathing, windows blinking on and off, people heading to work, to life, to whatever stories they were writing that day. I stood there a long time, not waiting, just arriving. I looked down through the skylight at the people below. Sandra laughing, Dan leaning in to listen, Miguel sipping coffee, arms crossed in the exact posture I once taught him without teaching. None of them noticed me up there, and that was the point. I wasn't there to be seen, just to see that they no longer needed to look up for permission. They had learned to move forward, not because of me, but beyond me. I turned toward the door, took one final look, and whispered, not goodbye, just, you've got this now. And I meant it. I didn't need them to remember my name. Names fade, plaques tarnish, photos get replaced when the decor changes. What doesn't fade is the way a room feels when people speak to each other with care. What doesn't tarnish is how a hallway holds its hush when trust has been earned there. What never gets replaced is the memory of how someone made the place feel safe, without saying a word. I've learned something over the years. Not everyone needs to lead from the front. Some of us were meant to hold the door, to make sure the lights stay on, to clean up quietly after the applause dies down. It's not lesser work, it's foundational. You don't build culture in press releases. You build it in the pause before you speak to someone you think is beneath you. You build it in whether you refill the coffee pot, when you take the last cup. You build it when you remember that the person who locks the building at night deserves the same respect as the one whose name is on the letterhead. I've seen people rise fast and fall faster. I've seen people speak the right words and still leave the room colder than they found it. But I've also seen people who say little, whose hands are rough from real labor, whose backs are tired but still upright, change a workplace just by being good over and over again. That's the kind of legacy I believe in. And so, I walk slower now. Not because I'm weak, but because I finally trust the floor beneath me to hold. I finally trust the people beside me to notice when something needs to be picked up. I finally trust that the work continues, even when I'm not the one doing it. I don't need their apologies. I don't need their applause. I only want them to remember this. Some of us never closed the door, not even when it was cold, not even when no one said thank you, not even when they called us just the janitor. We stayed, not to be seen, but so others could pass through, and maybe, just maybe, leave the place better than they found it.